Right now, a country of about 5.5 million people, fewer residents than the greater Houston metro area, owns a sovereign wealth fund worth somewhere north of $1.7 trillion, holding a stake in roughly 9,000 companies across nearly every stock market on Earth, amounting to something close to 1.5% of every publicly listed company in the entire world. Do the math on that, and the average Norwegian citizen, infant to retiree, is sitting on a theoretical share of national wealth worth somewhere around $300,000 without having done a single thing to earn it personally. And here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. 60 years ago, before any of this existed, Norway was a modest, unremarkable fishing and shipping economy that geologists had all but written off as a place to find any oil at all. This is a story of how a country that almost didn't find its own fortune ended up managing it more responsibly than almost anyone else who ever has. If the idea of an entire nation quietly becoming one of the largest shareholders on the planet without most of the world noticing sounds like the setup to a heist movie, subscribe now. Because the actual heist here is Norway successfully stealing self-discipline from a genre of country that almost never manages it. Through the 1960s, as oil companies scrambled to explore the North Sea following major discoveries off the coast of the Netherlands, Norway issued exploration licenses to international oil companies with, frankly, fairly low expectations. Well after well came up dry along the Norwegian continental shelf. Enough failed attempts that some geologists began quietly suggesting Norway's portion of the North Sea simply wasn't going to produce anything worth the trouble, an assessment the Norwegian government itself seems to have half believed, given how modest its initial ambitions for the whole enterprise were. Then, on Christmas Eve of 1969, Phillips Petroleum's drilling crew, on essentially their last scheduled well before packing up the season's exploration effort, struck a massive oil and gas field that would become known as Ekofisk. Norwegian newspapers understandably nicknamed it the Christmas gift, since it arrived on exactly that date and solved exactly the problem of a country that had, until that specific week, mostly been famous internationally for salmon, shipping, and extremely photogenic fjords. Here is where most resource-rich countries in modern history take a hard, predictable turn, and where Norway, for reasons that still get studied in economics departments worldwide, did something considerably less predictable. In 1971, the Norwegian parliament adopted what became informally known as the 10 Oil Commandments, a set of guiding principles establishing that petroleum resources should benefit Norwegian society as a whole, that the state should take an active ownership role, rather than simply handing extraction rights to foreign companies for a modest royalty, and that development should proceed at a controlled, sustainable pace rather than an immediate all-out extraction rush. In 1972, Norway established a state oil company, eventually known as Statoil, and structured the entire industry around majority state ownership, meaning the profits from Norwegian oil would flow substantially to the Norwegian public treasury, not primarily to foreign shareholders sitting in another country's boardrooms. This is, worth pausing on, a genuinely unusual level of institutional patience for a small country that had just discovered it was suddenly, unexpectedly, sitting on a fortune. Most nations discovering this kind of wealth have historically responded with something closer to an immediate national spending spree, understandably, because turning down free money is a spectacularly difficult thing for any government to do gracefully. Norway, instead, wrote the rules first and drilled second, which is roughly the economic equivalent of winning the lottery and calling a financial planner before you've even cashed a ticket, a level of discipline that should sound almost suspiciously boring, and is somehow the entire secret of this story. By the late 1980s, as North Sea oil revenue was climbing rapidly, Norwegian policymakers grew concerned about a well-documented economic trap known among economists as the resource curse, or, more specifically, Dutch disease, named after the Netherlands' own experience with 1960s natural gas boom that ended up inflating the Dutch currency, hollowing out other domestic industries, and leaving the country worse off in several respects than before the gas was found. Norway's solution, formalized with the creation of the Government Petroleum Fund in 1990, later renamed the Government Pension Fund Global, was disarmingly simple in concept and genuinely difficult in practice. Take the vast majority of oil revenue and invest almost entirely outside Norway in foreign stocks, bonds, and real estate, rather than spending inside the domestic economy at all. This sounds, on its face, like an oddly ungenerous thing for a government to do with a newfound fortune, until you understand the actual goal. Flooding a small domestic economy with sudden oil wealth tends to spike local prices, inflate the currency, make everything else the country produces more expensive to export, and ultimately shrink every other industry that isn't oil, leaving the country dangerously dependent on a single, famously volatile commodity. By investing the money abroad instead, Norway effectively decided to get rich slowly and invisibly, letting the fund compound quietly in foreign markets while the domestic Norwegian economy kept functioning on its own separate, considerably more boring, considerably more stable footing. A pile of money, on its own, has never stopped the government from spending it unwisely. So in 2001, Norway adopted what's become known as the fiscal rule, later called the spending rule, stipulating that the government could only draw down roughly 4% annually from the fund, later revised down to a more conservative 3%, representing the fund's expected long-term real rate of return, while the actual principle itself stayed permanently untouched, reinvested to keep growing for future generations. This single, almost boringly technical piece of budgetary discipline is arguably the single most important decision in this entire story, since it is precisely the discipline most oil-rich nations, flush with sudden cash and understandably eager to spend it on immediate popular programs, have historically struggled to maintain. Norway essentially told its own government, in writing, "You are allowed to spend the interest, and only the interest, forever," a rule considerably easier to state on paper than to actually follow when there's over $1 trillion sitting right there, technically available every single budget cycle. The fund, managed by a division of the Norwegian central bank called Norges Bank Investment Management, has grown into one of the largest single investors in the entire global stock market, holding meaningful stakes in essentially every major public company you've ever heard of, along with several thousand you almost certainly haven't. It owns roughly 1.5% of all publicly listed shares in the world, a figure that makes it, by some measures, the single largest sovereign wealth fund on the planet, larger than similar funds run by oil-rich Gulf states with vastly larger oil reserves and, in several cases, vastly larger populations. A country smaller than the state of Minnesota has, through nothing more dramatic than disciplined saving and patient investing, become a landlord to a meaningful slice of practically the entire global economy, a fact that would sound like a wildly implausible thriller plot if it weren't documented in painfully transparent quarterly reports that anyone with an internet connection can go read for themselves right now. Here's a detail that tends to genuinely surprise people expecting a purely profit-maximizing sovereign fund. Norway's fund operates under an ethical mandate, guided by an independent council on ethics that can recommend excluding companies involved in activities the Norwegian public has decided it doesn't want its collective national fortune quietly funding, including producers of cluster munitions, certain tobacco products, and, in a detail that has generated its own share of very pointed commentary, some coal-heavy fossil fuel operations, raising the genuinely spicy irony of an oil-funded trillion-dollar war chest occasionally divesting from other people's fossil fuels on ethical grounds. It's the financial equivalent of the world's most successful oil company running a strict no-smoking policy in its own break room, and Norway has, largely, leaned into the contradiction rather than pretending it doesn't exist, treating the fund's ethical guidelines as a genuine expression of Norwegian values rather than a purely symbolic gesture nobody actually enforces. While the fund quietly grew abroad, Norway used its oil wealth at home with the same disciplined, deliberately unglamorous approach, investing heavily in universal health care, free higher education, extensive parental leave, and one of the most robust social safety nets among developed nations, while consistently ranking among the very top countries globally on measures of income equality, public trust, and general quality of life. Norway's minimum wage isn't even set by law at all, a detail that surprises people expecting the world's most generous welfare state to also have the world's most detailed labor code, and instead relies on strong collective bargaining agreements between unions and employers, a system built on a level of institutional trust that countries with considerably more mandatory legislation on the books still, somehow, manage to have less of in practice. Norway consistently ranks near the very top of global happiness rankings, a genuinely difficult metric to game, and one that suggests the discipline behind a trillion-dollar fund isn't some isolated financial trick, but a broader national habit of choosing the boring, sustainable long-term option over the exciting, immediately gratifying one, repeated across essentially every major policy decision for half a century running. it's worth briefly sitting with what usually happens instead. Elsewhere, Venezuela, sitting on the largest proven oil reserves on the entire planet, spend decades of oil boom revenue on subsidized domestic consumption and state spending rather than durable, diversified saving, and has since suffered one of the most severe economic collapses of any country in modern peacetime history, with hyperinflation and mass immigration following a spectacular oil price down in the country's finances had never been insulated against. Nigeria, another major oil producer, has struggled for decades with corruption, underinvestment in other industries, and a currency perpetually distorted by petroleum revenue. Norway is not simply a country that got lucky with a Christmas Eve oil discovery. Plenty of countries have gotten lucky with oil discoveries. Norway is, more precisely, one of the very few countries in modern history that got lucky and then had the extraordinarily rare collective discipline to treat the luck like a long-term inheritance instead of a lottery ticket to be cashed immediately, which turns out to be the considerably harder half of the entire equation. Even Norway's own planners are candid that North Sea oil production, having peaked years ago, will continue gradually declining over coming decades, and Norway has increasingly positioned to fund itself, rather than continued oil extraction, as the country's real long-term economic engine going forward, a deliberate pivot from being an oil economy to being, essentially, one of the largest institutional investors on the planet that happens to have a small, prosperous country attached to it. Whether this model can be meaningfully replicated by other resource-rich nations remains a genuinely open and heavily debated question among economists, since Norway benefited from a small, already well-governed, low-corruption population making these decisions collectively, conditions that are, unfortunately, not something you can simply photocopy and hand to a country that doesn't already have them. What Norway has proven, at minimum, is that the resource curse was never actually inevitable. It was simply what happened to almost every country that didn't have Norway's particular, almost stubborn commitment to leaving the money alone. Strip away the trillion-dollar figures and the ethical investment committees, and the core lesson underneath Norway's entire economic story is almost aggressively unglamorous. Find money, don't spend it all immediately. Write the rules down before you're tempted to break them, and let patience compound quietly for half a century. It is not a thrilling formula. It will not make an exciting movie, and it is, apparently, so difficult to actually follow that Norway remains one of the only countries on Earth to have genuinely pulled it off at this scale, which might be the most honest wow moment in this entire story. The secret to building something close to a perfect economy wasn't a secret at all. It was right there the whole time. Almost nobody else could resist spending it. If a country the size of Minnesota quietly outsaved every oil-rich nation on the planet just by refusing to touch its own piggy bank, you'll want to see which country tried the exact opposite approach next. Subscribe, and tell us in the comments which economy you want us to break down next.